Ethan had just returned home from work when he noticed something strange at his front door. There, sitting on the welcome mat, was a small wooden box. It looked old, with rough edges and dark stains on the surface. The box was about the size of a shoebox, and the wood looked like it had been weathered by time. There was no label on it, no return address, and no sign of who had left it there. Ethan's curiosity immediately kicked in. He looked around, wondering if someone had accidentally dropped it, or if it was just some random delivery. But there was no one in sight. He bent down to inspect it further, running his fingers over the worn-out surface. The box felt heavy for its size. It made no noise when he shook it, which only added to the mystery. For a moment, Ethan considered leaving it where it was. After all, it could be nothing more than a mistake, or perhaps even a prank. But something inside him pushed him to open it. Maybe it was the strange weight of the box, or the idea that it could hold something interesting. Either way, he couldn't resist. Taking a deep breath, Ethan brought the box inside. He set it down on the kitchen table and grabbed a small knife to cut through the twine that was wrapped around it. As he slowly sliced through the string, his heart began to race. He wasn't sure why, but there was something about this box that felt important. The knife finally cut through the last bit of twine. With shaking hands, Ethan lifted the lid of the box. Inside, he found a surprise that no one could have expected. At first, Ethan thought he was seeing things. There, lying in the box, was a young woman. Her body was curled up, and she looked almost lifeless. She was wrapped in a thick blanket, and her face was hidden. But her delicate hands, peeking out from the blanket, looked real, human. Ethan froze. He stared at the woman, not sure if he was dreaming or if this was somehow real. For a few moments, he couldn't breathe. His mind was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How had she gotten into the box? Why was she inside? And who had left her there? The questions swirled in his mind, and he could feel his heart racing in his chest. Ethan quickly stepped back, his mind still struggling to process what was happening. He looked around his small kitchen, as if expecting someone to jump out and laugh, telling him it was all a joke. But no one appeared. It was just him, alone with a box and a woman he didn't know. His first instinct was to call the police, but something told him to hold off. He needed to be sure. Was she okay? Was she alive? He gently approached the box again, heart pounding in his chest. As he reached out to touch her shoulder, he was relieved to feel the warmth of her skin. She was alive. Ethan's mind raced again. He could hear his own breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "What happened to you?" he whispered, though the woman didn't respond. He felt a strange responsibility to help her. But how? What was going on? And who had done this? Ethan knew he had to find answers, but all he had was a mysterious box, a young woman inside it, and countless questions he had no idea how to answer. Ethan took a deep breath as he stared down at the young woman still lying motionless in the box. His mind was racing with questions he couldn't answer. How had she ended up there? Why was she left at his doorstep? And who was responsible for all of this? His hands trembled as he carefully reached down to touch her. Gently, he shook her shoulder, hoping she would wake up. "Hey," he whispered, trying not to startle her. "Are you okay?" At first, there was no response. She remained still, her face pale, and her breathing slow. Ethan felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He didn't know what to do. She looked so fragile, so helpless. It was almost as if she had been in this box for a long time. Then, after a few seconds, the woman's eyes fluttered open. At first, she looked confused. Her eyes glazed over. It seemed like she didn't understand where she was. She blinked several times, trying to focus on Ethan. And then, slowly, she sat up. Her movements were shaky, and she looked around as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. The room was unfamiliar to her, and so was Ethan. She gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "You're safe. You're at my house. You were. In a box, he said, his voice trembling. Do you remember anything? The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if she was trying to piece everything together. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and uncertain. I don't remember. I don't know how I got here. Ethan tried his best to reassure her. It's okay. We'll figure this out together. Do you need water? Or something to eat? She nodded slightly, her eyes filled with confusion. Ethan quickly got her a glass of water, which she drank in small sips. She was quiet for a long time, as though she was trying to gather her thoughts. Ethan waited patiently, giving her the space she needed. After a few minutes of silence, the woman finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. I'm sorry. I don't know who did this, she said, her voice shaky. I was taken. They took me. Ethan's heart sank. Taken? Who? Why? He asked, leaning closer to her, hoping for more answers. The woman's eyes flickered with fear. She bit her lip, clearly struggling to remember. I was kidnapped from my home. They locked me up somewhere. I don't know how long I've been there. And then, they put me in this box. I think I was being sent somewhere. I was going to be sold, but I don't know where. I don't know why. Ethan listened in shock. The woman's story sounded unbelievable, but there was something in her voice that made him believe her. She didn't look like someone who would make up such a terrifying tale. Don't worry, Ethan said, trying to stay calm for both their sakes. You're safe now. I'll help you. The woman gave him a small, grateful smile, but her eyes were filled with sadness. She didn't seem fully convinced that she was truly safe yet. Ethan knew this was far from over. The woman had been through something horrible, and now it was up to him to help her find out who had done this, and why. Ethan sat across from the woman who had introduced herself as Maria. She was now sitting up, wrapped in a blanket and drinking some more water. Her eyes were still clouded with confusion, but there was something in her voice that told Ethan she was determined to remember what had happened to her. As he watched her, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to this strange situation were hidden somewhere, and he was the one who needed to find them. The woman was clearly in danger, and he couldn't let her down. I'm going to find out who did this, Ethan promised, his voice filled with determination. Maria nodded weakly. I don't know who they were. I don't even know where I was taken. It was all so fast. I'm scared. Ethan knew that Maria needed time to process everything, but the longer she remained confused, the more worried he became. The thought that someone might still be looking for her kept running through his mind. He stood up and paced the room, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he call the police right away? He hesitated. It felt like there was more to the story, something deeper he needed to uncover first. But where would he start? Ethan glanced at the wooden box again. It was still sitting on the kitchen table, a strange and silent reminder of everything that had happened. He walked over to it and inspected it closely, hoping to find some clue that might help him. The box didn't seem special at first glance. It was old and weathered, with no labels or markings. But the weight of it, the strange way it felt, told him that it wasn't just an ordinary package. He ran his fingers over the surface again, looking for something he might have missed. As he did, his fingers brushed against a small piece of paper that was stuck inside the lid. Ethan carefully peeled it off and unfolded it. It was a note, written in a language he didn't understand. Maria looked over and saw him holding the note. "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan stared at the strange characters. "I don't know," he said, his brow furrowed, "but it might be important." Maria squinted at the note. She seemed to recognize something in the strange writing, but she shook her head. I don't know. I've seen this before, but I can't remember where." Ethan felt a spark of hope. Maybe Maria's memory wasn't as lost as he thought. "Do you think you can remember what it says? Anything that might help?" Maria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to recall the meaning of the symbols. It's not exactly the same, but it looks like the writing I saw when they kept me. There were other people like me, others who were locked up. Ethan's heart sank as he listened. So there are others? He asked, his voice filled with urgency. Is there a group behind this? Who did this to you? Maria took a deep breath and nodded. I think they were part of something big. I don't know the details, but I saw other people being held in different places. They called it the operation. They said we were going to be sold. Ethan clenched his fists. He now knew that Maria wasn't the only one. And if they were trying to sell people like her, there were probably others out there. He had to act quickly. Don't worry, Maria, Ethan said softly. We're going to figure this out. I'm going to make sure no one else gets hurt. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Maria's help, he was determined to uncover the truth. The thought of the people who had done this to her filled him with anger. And he knew that whatever it took, he would stop them. Ethan sat next to Maria, his mind racing with all the new information she had just shared. He could feel the weight of her words, the idea that she wasn't alone, that there were others who had been taken like her. It made his stomach turn. He needed to know more, but it was clear that Maria was still struggling to remember everything. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling as she clutched the blanket around her. Maria took a deep breath and looked at Ethan, as if deciding how much to tell him. I'll try to remember more, she said quietly, her voice soft but full of pain. I know it's hard to believe, but I wasn't the only one. I saw others. We were all kept in different places. Ethan nodded, trying to reassure her. I believe you, Maria. I just need to know everything you can remember. It might help us find out who did this. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, as if focusing on the past. They kept me in a dark room at first. It felt like I was in some kind of warehouse. There were other people there, too. I couldn't see them clearly at first, but I could hear them. Sometimes I heard their voices, and other times, just silence. It was terrifying. Ethan listened carefully, his heart aching for her. What else do you remember? He asked, his voice gentle. Maria shifted slightly, still lost in the memory. I remember being watched. There were guards, people who made sure we didn't try to escape. They were always there, standing by the doors. They were so serious, never smiling, never speaking. I think they were just doing their job, but it felt like they didn't care about us. Ethan felt a deep anger building inside him. These people had treated her like she was nothing. But he kept his focus on Maria. He needed to help her remember. And the box? Ethan asked. Do you remember when they put you in it? Maria nodded slowly. Yes. After a few weeks, they moved me. I didn't know where we were going, but they put me in this box. It was small, but it wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling of being trapped. I knew I was going to be taken somewhere far away. Ethan could hear the fear in her voice, and it made him even more determined to find the people who had done this to her. Do you remember anything about the people who were keeping you? He asked. Any details? Maria hesitated, her eyes clouded with confusion. They didn't tell us their names, but I remember one man. He was the one who gave orders. He wore a black suit. He seemed in charge. He wasn't very tall, but he had a cold smile. He looked at us like we were just things, not people. Ethan's fists clenched as he thought about the man who had treated Maria like that. What happened after you were put in the box? He asked, his voice tense with worry. I was in the box for a long time, Maria replied, her eyes distant as she recalled the experience. I lost track of time. It was dark and tight, and I couldn't move. I thought I was going to die in there. But then, somehow, I woke up, and I was here. I was in the box that you found. Ethan's mind raced as he processed everything. There were still so many questions, but at least Maria was starting to remember more. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. He had to act fast. Whoever had done this wasn't going to stop with Maria. "We're going to figure this out," Ethan said firmly. "I promise you. No one else is going to go through what you did." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Ethan didn't know how much longer Maria would need to heal from her trauma, but he was sure of one thing. He wasn't going to stop until he found the people who would put her through this. He would get to the bottom of it, no matter what. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the small, crumpled note he had found inside the wooden box. He had spent hours trying to make sense of the strange characters, but they still made no sense to him. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was no ordinary case. The people behind Maria's kidnapping weren't just criminals. They were organized, powerful, and dangerous. Maria was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her hands resting nervously in her lap. She had told him everything she could remember, and now it was time for Ethan to take action. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. The police might be able to help, but he knew the situation was bigger than just one woman. He had to act fast before anyone else got hurt. "I need to find out more about that note," Ethan said to Maria, his voice filled with determination. "It's the only clue we have right now." Maria looked up at him, still unsure about everything. "I don't think I can help with that," she said quietly. "I don't remember enough about the people who took me. I was too scared to pay attention to their names or their faces." Ethan nodded, understanding her fear. "It's okay. I'm going to do some digging. We'll find out who's behind this." With Maria's safety as his top priority, Ethan began researching everything he could about human trafficking rings and organized crime. He searched online for any mention of similar cases. It wasn't long before he found disturbing reports about people being kidnapped and sold for unknown purposes. The idea made his stomach turn, but he couldn't back down now. Ethan also contacted a few trusted friends who worked in law enforcement. He didn't want to alert the police just yet. He feared the people responsible for Maria's capture might be too dangerous for normal law enforcement. Instead, he asked his contacts for any advice or leads they might have. They promised to keep an eye out and said they would help discreetly. As Ethan worked tirelessly, Maria remained in the background, lost in her thoughts. She hadn't said much, but Ethan knew she was struggling with the weight of everything that had happened to her. She had been through so much, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Late that evening, Ethan received a call from one of his contacts. His friend had found something. A list of names connected to human trafficking operations. One name, in particular, stood out. Ethan's heart raced as he read the information. "This is it," Ethan muttered to himself. "We're getting closer." The name on the list was linked to an international network, one that operated under the radar and often avoided detection. Ethan's friend warned him to be cautious. "These people are dangerous, Ethan. Don't take any chances." Ethan knew his friend was right. He had no intention of rushing in without a plan. But now, at least, he had a direction. He had to follow the trail and gather as much information as possible. He wouldn't rest until Maria was safe, and the people who had done this were brought to justice. He walked back to the living room, where Maria was sitting. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in a while, he saw a flicker of hope. "We're getting closer," Ethan told her, trying to reassure her. "I'm not going to stop until we find out who did this to you, and make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Maria nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely just yet, but she knew Ethan was the only one who had stood by her when everything seemed hopeless. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind focused on the road ahead. He had a long way to go, and many obstacles still stood in his path, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had a purpose now, and he wouldn't stop until the truth was uncovered. Ethan spent the next few days digging deeper into the information he had gathered. With each new detail, his concern grew. The more he learned, the more he realized just how dangerous the people behind Maria's kidnapping were. He couldn't trust anyone easily, and his sense of urgency only grew stronger. Maria's safety was his top priority, but he knew that uncovering the truth meant taking risks. As he worked tirelessly, Maria remained by his side, but she still seemed distant. Ethan could tell that she was trying to process everything that had happened, but it wasn't easy. Her mind would often drift to the past, to the dark memories of being trapped in that cold room. Ethan could only imagine how hard it must be for her. One afternoon, as Ethan was going over the details of his latest research, his phone rang. It was his friend in law enforcement. Ethan had contacted him earlier, asking for help with the investigation, but he didn't expect anything significant to come from it. He was wrong. "Ethan, we found something." His friend's voice came through the phone, sounding serious. "You were right to be cautious. We've uncovered a link to the group that's been running human trafficking operations. They've been operating in several countries, and they're bigger than we thought. You were right to dig into this." Ethan's heart raced. "What have you found? Do you know where they are? Where they're keeping people?" "I don't have all the answers yet, but I found a few names connected to this group," his friend replied. "It's going to take time to track them down, but we're making progress. Just be careful, Ethan. These people have power. They know how to cover their tracks." Ethan nodded, even though his friend couldn't see him. "I'll be careful. I'm not going to stop." "What's the next step?" "Keep looking for more leads, but this time, let us help you. We'll take it from here, and we'll work together on this. I'll keep you updated." Ethan ended the call, his mind racing with new information. The authorities were now involved, and although it gave him a sense of relief, it also made him feel uneasy. These criminals were dangerous, and the more attention they drew to the case, the more likely it was that they'd go into hiding. Turning to Maria, who was sitting quietly on the couch, Ethan spoke softly. "The police are helping us now. They've found some leads, and they're working on tracking down the people responsible for all this." Maria nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. She didn't fully trust the police yet, especially after everything she had been through. Ethan understood her hesitation, but hoped that time would heal some of her doubts. The authorities were their best shot at bringing the criminals to justice, but he couldn't ignore Maria's concerns. "I don't know if I trust them," Maria said quietly, looking up at Ethan. "They didn't help me before. How do I know they'll help now?" Ethan sat next to her, offering a reassuring smile. "I understand how you feel, but we have to trust them now. They're our best chance at finding out who did this and making sure they can't hurt anyone else." Maria seemed to think about it for a moment before nodding slowly. She was still scared, but Ethan could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes. He could feel the weight of the situation, but he wasn't going to give up. He would protect Maria and see this through to the end. As they sat there in silence, waiting for more news, Ethan knew one thing for sure. The road ahead would be difficult, but with the police involved, they were finally moving in the right direction. The criminals who had taken Maria were about to face justice, and Ethan wasn't going to stop until that happened. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The phone call with his friend in law enforcement had given him hope, but it also left him uneasy. The criminals they were dealing with weren't ordinary criminals. They were smart, powerful, and dangerous. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to stop him from uncovering the truth. As the night went on, Ethan lay awake, his mind spinning. He had barely gotten any sleep when, just after dawn, his phone rang again. He quickly answered, hoping it was more good news. "Ethan, we've got a problem." His friend's voice was tense on the other end of the line. "It looks like someone's been watching you. We've been getting reports of people asking questions around your area. Be careful. These people will stop at nothing." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't even considered that the criminals might be keeping track of him. He looked over at Maria, who was sleeping peacefully on the couch. She had finally gotten some rest after the stress of the past few days. Ethan had promised her he would protect her, but now it seemed that danger was closing in from all sides. "What should I do?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Get out of there. His friend replied quickly. Pack your things. Take Maria and go somewhere safe. We'll handle the rest. Ethan didn't need any more convincing. He grabbed his phone and turned to Maria. Her eyes fluttered open as she stretched. When she saw the worried look on his face, she sat up immediately. What's wrong? She asked, her voice still groggy. They're after us, Maria, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. We have to leave now. Maria's eyes widened in fear. What do you mean? Who? They've been watching us, Ethan explained quickly. I don't know how they found us, but they know we're onto them. We have to go. And we have to go now. Maria didn't ask any more questions. She quickly gathered her things while Ethan packed up a few essentials. He didn't know how much time they had, but he knew they had to act fast. Within moments, they were on the road, driving away from the apartment. Ethan didn't know where they were going. He just had to get as far away as possible. The city's busy streets were becoming more dangerous with each passing minute, and Ethan felt a growing sense of urgency. As they drove, Maria turned to Ethan. Do you think we'll be safe? Ethan took a deep breath, trying to reassure her. We're going to be okay. The police are working on it, and we're going to stay ahead of them. They won't find us if we're careful. But deep down, Ethan knew there was no guarantee. The criminals they were up against were ruthless. They would do anything to keep their operations running, and Maria was a key part of that operation. They drove for hours, taking side roads and avoiding main highways. The more they moved, the more Ethan felt the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Maria, about keeping her safe no matter what it took. After a while, they stopped at a small roadside diner to grab some food. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Every glance over his shoulder made him nervous, but he couldn't show it to Maria. She needed him to stay calm. We'll be fine, he repeated to her, though the words felt hollow. He knew the real challenge was just beginning. He had to protect Maria, find the criminals, and make sure they were stopped once and for all. But as they sat in the diner, Ethan couldn't help but feel that they had already crossed a line. They were no longer just a man and a woman trying to figure out what happened. Now, they were part of something much bigger, something dangerous, and the fight for Maria's freedom was just getting started. Ethan and Maria had been on the run for nearly a week now. Every day, they moved to a new location, always keeping one step ahead of the people searching for them. They stayed in small motels, rented cars, and kept their distance from anyone who might recognize them. Despite their best efforts, the sense of danger was always with them, looming just over their shoulders. One evening, as they sat in a small cabin they had rented in a remote area, Ethan received another call. His heart raced as he saw the name on the screen. It was his friend from law enforcement. Ethan, his friend said, sounding urgent, they're closing in. We've found out where they're keeping the rest of the people, but you need to get there before they move them. If we wait too long, they'll disappear. Ethan's mind was already racing. The group behind Maria's kidnapping had been operating for years, but this was their chance to stop them for good. He had to act quickly. Where are they? Tell me where to go. His friend gave him the location, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that no one would have ever suspected. Ethan knew it was now or never. We'll be there as soon as we can, Ethan said, hanging up the phone. Maria, who had been listening quietly, looked up at him. What's going on? What's the plan? We're going to stop them, Ethan replied, determination in his voice. I know where they're keeping the others. We're going to save them and bring these people down. Maria nodded, her expression serious. She didn't want to go back to the place where she had been kept, but she knew it was the only way to make sure others wouldn't suffer the same fate. She trusted Ethan, and together, they would do whatever it took to end this nightmare. They didn't waste any time. After packing their things, they got in the car and started driving. The drive to the warehouse felt long, but every second counted. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he thought about what they were about to face. He couldn't let fear control him now. He had to stay focused on the mission. As they arrived at the warehouse, Ethan noticed the area was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no guards, no security cameras, and no obvious signs of activity. It looked like an ordinary abandoned building, but Ethan knew better. Something was hidden inside. He could feel it. He and Maria crept up to the entrance, carefully checking for any signs of danger. They had no backup. This was a dangerous operation, and they were going in alone. Ethan motioned for Maria to stay close and then pushed the door open just a crack. He peered inside, scanning the dimly lit room. What he saw made his heart race. There were people inside, several men and women, all locked in cages, looking disoriented and terrified. They had been kept in the same way Maria had, hidden away, waiting to be sold. Ethan's stomach churned at the sight, but he couldn't let the anger overwhelm him. Now was the time for action. "Maria, stay behind me," he whispered. He moved quickly, silently, toward the cages. As he reached the first one, he saw a man approaching in the shadows. It was the same man who had been in charge of the operation, the one Maria had described. Ethan didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he tackled the man to the ground, holding him down before he could react. The fight was over in seconds, but the damage had already been done. The leader of the operation was out of the picture. Maria moved forward, unlocking the cages one by one, helping the others escape. Ethan watched, making sure no one else was in the building. They had done it. They had freed the people who had been held captive for so long. As they made their way out, Ethan felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had won, but the battle wasn't over yet. The authorities would take care of the criminals, but for Ethan and Maria, the road to healing was just beginning. The fight for freedom had been long and dangerous, but in the end, it was worth it. Ethan and Maria sat quietly on the porch of a small house they had found in a peaceful town. The evening air was cool, and the sun was setting, casting soft colors across the sky. It had been several weeks since the confrontation at the warehouse, and things had finally started to settle down. Maria had been through so much, but now she was safe. The people who had taken her, and so many others, were in police custody, their operations shut down. The authorities had handled the criminals, and the victims, including Maria, were now free. But for Ethan, the journey had been just as intense. He had risked everything to protect her, to make sure she didn't become another forgotten name. Maria had trusted him, and he had kept his promise to help her. In the process, he had found something unexpected, a deep connection with her. Maria looked over at Ethan, a small smile on her face. "I still can't believe it's over," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. "I'm safe now. After all this time, I'm finally free." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's hard to believe sometimes," he replied. "But we made it. We stopped them." For a long time, Maria had been afraid of what would happen if she ever got out. The memories of being held captive haunted her, and she wondered if she would ever feel normal again. But with each passing day, she was beginning to heal. The nightmares were still there, but they were starting to fade. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" Maria asked, her voice quiet. "I mean, how do you go on after something like this?" Ethan thought about it for a moment. "Normal might be different now, but it doesn't have to be bad. You've got your life ahead of you, Maria. And you've got me. We'll figure it out together." Maria smiled at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Ethan shrugged. "You would have been fine. You're stronger than you think." Maria was still adjusting to her new life, but the change had been more than just physical. She had grown emotionally, too. The person who had walked into Ethan's life days ago was not the same person who sat beside him now. She had found her courage again, and in a way, so had Ethan. As the days passed, they began to make plans for their future. Maria had a new sense of purpose, and she was determined to help others who had gone through what she had. She joined a local group dedicated to raising awareness about human trafficking, working to make sure no one else would have to suffer as she had. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself feeling more at peace. He hadn't known how much helping Maria would change his life, but it had. The sense of purpose he felt now was like nothing he'd ever experienced before. Together, they built a life full of hope and possibility. They knew that the past would always be a part of them, but it no longer controlled them. They had faced the darkest parts of life and come out stronger. As Maria stood beside Ethan, watching the sunset, she knew her journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice full of emotion. "For everything." Ethan smiled at her, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're here." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in silence, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Maria felt ready for whatever came next.